like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Hi, I'm Brianna.
And I'm Jim.
Welcome to our channel where we repair and restore vintage air-cooled cars and motorcycles.
Join us as we tackle everything from simple repairs and issues to complete restorations.
This is the second heater video. This is going to talk about the reinstallation of the heater and the reassembly of the heater. Refer back to part 1 for the disassembly of the heater and the cleaning. So this is the new glow plug. This one we're replacing because this is the old one, but we had this one for about 4 years in that heater, so that's why we're replacing it. We just need to replace it because it's older. The old one is still good. It's just good to keep it in case you go on like a trip or something and you need it. So we're going to replace the atomizer screens too. This is the old one that we had. See how dirty it is? And this is the new one. We're going to replace it because it might affect the fuel flow. So you're going to want to put the combustion chamber in. You're going to want to put the gasket in first. It only really goes one way. Go ahead and put that in. And then you're going to put this down like this. There's a groove right here. And there's a gasket. You're going to put that right in the grooves. And take your, line it up and put the screws back in. They're like these little Allen screws. Just go ahead and tighten them down just snug. Don't make them super tight. Okay. So once you have it snug, so now we're going to put the fan unit on. You're going to put the gasket on first. It only really goes one direction. Then you're going to put this side facing the port. And put the screws in. Make sure you have the lock washers on them. And if it doesn't really line up correctly, like you're having a hard time lining up, do your screws like every other one. So put one here and then one here, kind of offset it. It'll help you kind of keep lined up. Make it snug. I'm afraid to get my hands dirty that time. You're just going to want to make it snug again. You don't want to like break it. But you want it to be tight enough where it's not going to come back off. Okay, so now we're going to put the glow plug in. Make sure to put your atomizing screen on the bottom of this pencil, like a number 2. You push it all the way in to install it. Then just take your glow plug, start screwing that in like this, just to get it started. And then you're going to take the tool that came for the glow plug. You're going to put it around the wires because it has that slot just so it fits in that. Make sure it's all the way down. Just tighten it snug. And tighten it with the Phillips head screwdriver. Just make it a little snug. So now just put the gasket back in. You're going to have to probably shove it down a little bit. We used a flathead screwdriver to kind of push it down. It should just kind of like pop in.
All right, now we're going to reinstall the high temperature sensor. It just sets against the top of the housing and the wire runs between the fins. The wire bail that goes on here, there is a slot in one of the fins. Put it in. It goes across the top of the temperature sensor to hold it in place. And then the wire bail goes in and hooks into place. You need to be careful not to get the wire trapped in there. And sometimes it's handy to have, sometimes it's handy to have a pair of needle nose pliers. Sometimes it pops into place, sometimes it doesn't. But with the needle nose pliers, it makes it easy. So now we're going to put the circuit board in place. Has one screw and the clips at the front to hold it. And put this back on. This was a 3mm wrench for the circuit board. Then we have the connections that we have to plug back up. Remember, you have 3 connections. You have one 4-pin connector and a 3-pin and a 2-pin. So to put them back in place, we will plug the 4-pin up. Okay, 4-pin goes in. Then the 3-pin connector, which is the fan. And then we have the 2-pin connector, which is the high temperature sensor. So we have the 2-pin connector in, we have the 3-pin and the 4-pin, so all the wiring is done at this point. Now it's ready to go back into the housing. So the gasket or the rubber grommet that holds the electrical connector goes in, the unit slides in like this, and it has to go in there. This has to go down in the slot here. And everything should drop into place. There we go. Now, the rubber gasket goes back on here. Only goes one direction because you have the opening for the fuel line just coming through. Okay, now the top goes back on. And the end screws on. And the heater is back together and ready to put back into the chassis. Now we're ready to put the heater back into the chassis, and you have to line the bolts up and put it into place. Good. And your 4 nuts go on the 10mm studs, or 10mm nuts on the studs. Okay, once you've got them run down, you can take the ratchet and snug them down completely. Okay, right now. Next step is to put this plate back in, and this has all of your holes for the wiring, which need to be run before you put everything back together. A couple of times when I first started doing this, I would mistakenly put the plate back in and get everything done before I ran the wires back through the holes, and have to take it all back apart again because you couldn't get to anything to pick it back up. Alright, so that's good there. Okay, now Turn it this way. Once you have the plate in, you need to hook the wires up. This is the fuel pump wire, and simply plugs in from the controller. Then the fuel pump needs to be bolted back in place. And one thing on the fuel pump, there is an outlet side and an inlet side, and there is an arrow on it that shows which direction it goes. Always make sure it's pointed the correct direction. Fuel needs to be flowing uphill from the tank. If it's downhill, it will not work correctly. You want about a 30 to 45 degree angle on the pump. And that has that in place. Then your connection for the fuel pump needs to be put back on, and there's a wire bail that holds that in place. That simply snaps on from the bottom. And of course that one. Okay, that snaps on from the bottom, and that's all it takes to hold that on. Then the only other connection you've got is the main harness for the heater, and that simply connects as such, and that is ready. So all the wiring is done. Now we're ready to put the fuel tank back on. And to do that, we're going to turn the unit back up. But before we do that, we will reconnect the fuel line that goes to the bottom of the heater. And I'm putting new fuel line on. This is some diesel rated material, and it comes from McMaster Car. And it is 4mm ID. It's a nice tight fit. This is very flexible. It's clear enough that you can see the fuel flowing in it, so you can tell if you have bubbles in the fuel, which that's something you have to watch out for, because that means you've got air in your line. But the fuel line goes
through the bottom
and then connects, and you want it run beside the intake port, which will be cool, and you won't have to worry about heat burning the fuel line. I have seen people run them next to the exhaust line, and that doesn't work. So now we're ready to put the fuel tank back on. So we will turn the unit on end. And the fuel tank sits like this. And by doing it this way, we did not empty the fuel out, but it allows us to hook it up without spilling the fuel. Okay, the line is on, and we tighten the clamp. If I can get the screwdriver on, there we go. And make sure all your wires are clear of any of the sharp edges, or they don't really do a good job of deburring these things at the factory. Yeah. So you need to pay attention to that. Okay, you set the unit back up, and at this point it would be ready to put the cover back on, but you have to leave the cover off in order to bolt it down in the unit, so that's what we're going to do next.
And now we're ready to put the unit back in the bus. We're just going to reinstall.
Yeah, luckily Lucy has psychedelic peace symbol carpet, and the unit being on there makes a good mark in the carpet, so it's easier to realign it when we're ready to put it on. Ready to put the heater back in. Everything is pretty much lined up in position. Couple things, especially if you're doing this by yourself, or if you just want to make it a little easier, is if you set the unit up on a couple of blocks of wood, it raises it up to make it easier to get your connections underneath. Just a little easier, you can see what you're doing.
Yep.
What I normally like to do is put this thing in put the exhaust in from underneath and put the clamp on it, and do the same thing with the intake, and then drop it back down and tighten the bolts down. Now, I think I mentioned one time before about the clamps that come with the unit are not very good. Also, the seal is not that great between this exhaust pipe and the exhaust port. And with this connection being inside the unit, you run the risk of carbon monoxide leaking. We always keep a carbon monoxide detector in the bus just in case, you never know. But what I do is I put some high temperature sealant around the inside of the exhaust pipe before I slide it on and put the clamp on it. That gives me just a little bit extra layer of protection. I also do the same thing with the exhaust under the bus. Anything of the connections that are underneath the vehicle, I also put this high temperature sealant on, and it just gives me a little bit of peace of mind knowing that I have a little bit better connection on there.
When you install the heater, make sure that the exhaust is on a downward slope when you install it. That way condensation runs out the tailpipe. Also, there's a possibility of carbon monoxide, so make sure you have a carbon monoxide detector inside of the bus.
It's a good idea to have some spare parts with you and tools when you are camping or on the road in a vehicle in case you do need to work on the heater. It's good to have at least 1 or 2 sets of gaskets, a wrench for the glow plug, tools to disassemble the heater, maybe a spare clamp. Some people carry a spare fuel pump. If the unit's got some age on it, that's probably not a bad idea, but it's not something that I felt necessary to do at this point. I do make sure I've got a spare glow plug, a couple of spare atomizing screens, and like I said, everything you need to disassemble and reassemble the unit, because if it's going to fail, it's going to fail on a night when it's like 0 degrees outside and you're freezing cold. You really need to be able to work on it, especially if you're off grid. Another thing that I do during the winter, if it is going to be really cold, is I carry a sleeping bag rolled up in the bus. You can store it under the bed or wherever, and that way if the heater does quit, you do have a way to keep warm and make it through the night, and it's a whole lot better to work on the heater in the morning in the daylight than to try to fool with it in the middle of the night. So that's a few things you can try, and hopefully they'll help you out. One other thing that I like to carry in the bus is some spare diesel fuel, especially if you're off grid or you have the canopy set up or something and it's a lot of trouble to leave and go somewhere. Generally, I found that the heater will run about the entire weekend on 1 tank of diesel. But I've got a couple of these containers that hold 1,500 milliliters of diesel fuel, and they're really great for having some spare fuel. The cap seals well, you don't get any diesel smell in the vehicle, and these are available on Amazon or something like it, so you may want to think about carrying a little bit of spare fuel with you just in case.
This is a road former clamp. We got these off of Amazon. They're a lot better quality and they're stronger than the ones that come with the heater. So we recommend you get these. Oh, thanks.
Okay, so we've made the initial connections for the exhaust and the intake. We have those on. Now we're ready to remove the boards and lower the unit down into place. And we won't bore you with putting the bolts back in or anything like that, because that's something that doesn't take but a few minutes, and you can handle that if you can disconnect the heater.
Yep.
You have to hook the exhaust line up underneath and hang the intake, and then you're ready to put the cover back on, and the unit is ready to use at that point. So we hope you've enjoyed the videos. We hope that it's taught you something about the maintenance and care of these heaters, and if you have any questions or comments, we'll be glad to answer them. Thank you.
Please like and subscribe.